Following Emmanuel Macron's diplomatic tour of national capitals, the focus shifts back to Berlin on Thursday, where high-ranking officials are set to meet for separate talks. The Ukrainian president says those meetings could eventually pave the way for a summit involving himself and the leaders of Russia, France and Germany. Such a gathering would be aimed at reviving the stalled Minsk Agreement peace deal. Well, for more on what to expect, let's cross now to Berlin, where our correspondent Nick Spicer is standing by. Nick, the Minsk Accord, it's proven to be a real sticking point between Moscow and Kiev for most of the past decade, or since it was introduced back in 2015. What are the chances that it could be revived?
Well, at present, it seems pretty slim. It depends on the goodwill that both sides are willing to put in and what kind of diplomatic efforts the sort of shepherds, France and Germany, are able to undertake. There were two Minsk Accords. The second was really agreed under duress when Ukraine only had about 5,000 active soldiers at the time. We're surrounded. So the perception in Ukraine is that the accords are not something that the president should really abide by. So he has that domestic political problem. And if you read them, they're only 4 pages long. It's pretty hard to understand the sequencing of events. It calls for demilitarizing the areas where there's been conflict, mercenaries to leave and so on. It also calls for elections. It calls for negotiations with the leaders of the two sort of breakaway republics and some kind of autonomy. Now, the Russians think that the Ukrainian government should talk with the self-designated leaders in those areas who are pro-Kremlin leaders before there are elections. The Ukrainian thinks there should be elections so that the voice of the people can be heard. So there's all kinds of disagreement about the sequencing of things, and for any kind of negotiations to really come to some kind of conclusion, I think there needs to be clarity on how all of this works. When you read them, you just keep checking off the things that they promised to do that have not been done. So there's a lot of work for the two parties to undertake. A lot of goodwill will be needed, but I think the takeaway is perhaps you will have Ukrainians and Russians at the table. Once again, they tried to talk about this in Paris in the past 3 weeks, not very successfully, but at least there seems to be some kind of attempt at forward movement.
And Nick, meanwhile, the German Chancellor is engaging in what you might call verbal gymnastics over the controversial Nord Stream 2 gas pipeline. Tell us a little bit about what's happening there.
It's really the source of humor here in Germany. And, you know, if you're a fan of the Harry Potter series, it's almost a pipeline that cannot be named, like Lord Voldemort. Nord Stream 2, those are words that have not emerged from the mouth of German Chancellor Olaf Scholz, despite the attempts of all kinds of journalists to ask him, is that 1,200-kilometer pipeline on the table as leverage against Russia? And he'll typically respond by saying all kinds of options are on the table. Russia will feel all kinds of economic pain if it decides to invade Ukraine. But the fact of the matter is that Germany is sort of tied in knots around this 1,200-kilometer pipeline because it relies on Russia for lots of its gas exports. Olaf Scholz, in his defense, is saying that he wants to maintain strategic ambiguity by not saying what's on the table. But the American President Joe Biden stepped in for him and said that the Nord Stream pipeline, which is not yet pumping gas, would not pump gas if Russia were to invade Ukraine, and this through the American ability to impose sanctions on all kinds of companies that would be involved in using it. So Olaf Scholz not willing to pronounce the word Nord Stream 2, but the American president certainly is, and certainly seems to be willing to be using it as a weapon, as leverage against the Kremlin.
Nick Spicer reporting there from Berlin.